The wind screamed across the ridge. It was a wounded sound, a lonely sound. It slipped down through the black pines and hit the cabin like a fist. Inside, Clara lay on a cot, a thin quilt pulled to her chin. Her breath was shallow, a tiny puff of air in the crushing cold. Each inhale was a struggle against the weight of the child in her belly. She was heavy with life, but felt lighter than ash, like the next gust of wind might just carry her away. The storm pressed against the walls. It found every crack, every chink in the old wood. The shutters rattled, a merciless rhythm that echoed the beat of her own frightened heart. The sound reminded her how small she was, how forgotten. No one was coming. The wind whispered it. The rattling shutters confirmed it. She had been cast off, left to break against the rocks of this mountain. She was nothing. Her mind drifted back to a time of sunshine and promises, a time when she thought she'd walk down a church aisle, her arm linked with a man who had sworn his heart to her. But that dream died when her belly began to swell. The letters stopped coming. His name turned to poison on the tongues of her neighbors. In their eyes, she was a sinner, a fallen woman. The sheriff himself had looked her dead in the face, his voice flat and cold as a river stone. "A woman makes her choices," he'd said. "Now you live with them." So she had climbed, up here to the forgotten places, carrying her shame and her child, one heavy step at a time. Now a new enemy had come. Hunger. It gnawed at her ribs, a relentless biting thing. The cupboard held nothing but a few spoonfuls of cornmeal. She pressed a hand to her belly, whispering to the life inside. A faint flutter answered her, a tiny, stubborn kick. Even here at the edge of the world, life wanted to fight. But winter was closing its grip. The storm clawed at the walls, harder now, angrier, and then a sound that froze the blood in her veins. The door groaned. It swung open with a violent crack, torn from its latch by the wind. Snow and ice swirled into the room, a ghostly white vortex. And through that swirl stepped a figure. He was huge, broad enough to block out the flickering firelight, casting the entire cabin into shadow. For a second, Clara thought the storm itself had taken human form. His shoulders were like a cliff face, his coat a heavy buffalo hide. His beard was thick with frost. He filled the doorway, his silence heavier and more terrifying than the wind outside. Her fingers, weak and trembling, fumbled for the iron poker by the hearth. Wolves prowled these ridges, but no wolf wore boots that made the floorboards groan with such deliberate weight. The man stood motionless. She didn't know his name was Thomas. She didn't know anything. His eyes, gray and hard as granite, swept the room. They landed on her, a frail shape under a worn-out quilt. His gaze held steady. It wasn't threatening, but it wasn't kind either. It was just there. "What do you want?" Clara's voice was a ragged whisper, lost in the howl of the wind. The question hung in the air, brittle and useless. The man didn't answer. Instead, with a slow, unhurried motion, he reached into a satchel slung across his massive chest. He pulled out a bundle wrapped in rough cloth, tied with a leather cord. He took one step into the room, just one. He placed the bundle on the small, rickety table by the door. Then, without a single word, he turned and stepped back into the blizzard. The snow swallowed him whole. The door banged shut, and he was gone. Clara didn't move for a long, long time. The poker slipped from her grasp, clattering against the stone hearth. Her heart hammered against her ribs. It felt like she'd just seen a ghost. The bundle sat on the table. It was a simple, ordinary thing, yet it felt impossible. Finally, she staggered to her feet. Her clumsy fingers tore at the knots, desperate. Inside, she found strips of dried venison, a loaf of hard bread, a small tin of coffee. Food. Enough for days. Her knees gave out. She sank onto the stool, buried her face in her hands, and the sobs came. They were raw, ugly things, torn from a part of her she thought had died long ago. Gratitude burned through her, so hot and fierce it felt like shame. She hadn't asked for this. She had wanted to prove she could survive alone, and now she was being fed by a stranger's mercy. But she knew she would eat, because survival was more important than pride. And in the cold, empty place where despair had taken root, a tiny flicker of something else sparked to life. Someone had seen her. Someone knew she was here, and they hadn't turned away. The next morning, the world was buried in white. Clara forced herself out into the snow to fetch water. Her legs shook with the effort. The cold was a physical thing, a weight pressing on her chest. And then she saw him. He was standing among the pines at the edge of the clearing, half hidden in the shadows, just watching. She remembered the name now, a scrap of gossip from town. Thomas McGraw. A soldier, they'd said, a man who chose the mountains because he was no longer fit for the world of men. Whispers followed his name, whispers of blood and battle, whispers of a darkness that clung to him like a second skin. He didn't move. He just watched her with those unreadable stone-gray eyes. Clara clutched the bucket and scrambled back inside, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. This wasn't just a kind stranger. This was a dangerous man. That night, the gifts continued. She opened the door in the morning to find a stack of split firewood, dry and ready for the hearth. Beside it, a slab of salt pork. The day after, a jar of honey. Then a warm fur pelt. No footsteps ever marked the snow. No voice ever broke the silence. Just these offerings, left like a tribute at some forgotten altar. Her pride screamed at her to refuse them. She had come here to be strong, to stand on her own. Accepting his help felt like admitting defeat. It felt like she was admitting the town was right about her, that she was weak, fallen. But the child inside her didn't care about pride. The cold didn't care about dignity. Survival was a brutal, simple thing. One afternoon, the sun broke through the clouds, a pale, watery light. Clara stepped outside to gather snow for melting, but a wave of dizziness washed over her. The world tilted. Her knees buckled. She clutched her belly, gasping for breath, a cold fear snaking up her spine. When she looked up, he was there. Thomas, striding out of the trees with an armful of wood. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze taking in her pale face, her trembling hands. She tried to tell him to go, to leave her be, but the words wouldn't come. He knelt, set the logs by the door, and then did something that stunned her into silence. He drew an axe from his belt and began to split the wood. Stroke after steady stroke, the blade biting deep. The sound echoed in the clearing, a rhythm of pure, raw strength. He wasn't showing off. He wasn't trying to intimidate her. He was simply doing what needed to be done. When he finished, he rose, gave her one long, searching look, and melted back into the trees. Clara stood there, her breath misting in the air, watching a strength she couldn't comprehend. A strength offered without a single word, without a single demand. And she started to wonder if the stories about him were wrong. Or maybe they were only half the story. The blizzard returned that night with the fury of a cornered animal. Snow fell in thick, suffocating sheets, erasing the world. Clara needed water from the barrel just outside the door. She wrapped her shawl tight and stepped into the white chaos. The cold was a blade in her lungs. Her foot slipped on a patch of hidden ice. She went down hard. A lance of pure agony shot through her belly, and she cried out, a sound swallowed by the howling wind. Darkness swam at the edges of her vision. Then she heard it. Boots crunching on the snow, coming fast. Strong arms were under her, lifting her as if she weighed nothing. She was surrounded by the scent of pine and worn leather. Thomas. He carried her back inside, the door bursting open. He laid her gently on the cot, his movements clumsy but careful, as if he was afraid he might break her. He didn't speak. He just stoked the fire until it roared back to life, pushing the deadly cold back into the corners of the room. He pressed a cup of hot broth to her lips. She drank, the warmth spreading through her, chasing away the chill. She looked up at him, at his broad shadow moving against the wall, and in his eyes she saw it. Not pity, not judgment. It was something else entirely. It was reverence, as if her weakness, her frailty, was something to be protected, to be guarded. The storm raged outside, but inside a fragile peace began to bloom, and Clara knew, with a certainty that shook her to her core, that this man wasn't just bringing her food and wood. He was standing between her and the storm. But she was about to find out it wasn't just the storm in the sky he was fighting. The fire burned high, but a different kind of storm was breaking inside Clara. A sharp, tearing pain ripped through her. It stole her breath, left her gasping. She clutched the quilt, her eyes wide with a fresh wave of panic. The baby. It was coming. Now. In the middle of a blizzard, alone on a mountain with a man she didn't know. A man they said was a killer. Thomas was at her side in an instant. She saw the fear flicker in his eyes. This was a battle he didn't know how to fight. "Tell me what to do," he grunted, his voice rough with desperation. Clara could barely think through the waves of agony. "Water," she gasped. "Boil water. Clean cloths." He moved, clumsy but fast, filling a kettle, tearing strips from an old linen sheet. He fed logs into the fire until it blazed, his huge frame casting a dancing, protective shadow over her. The pain was relentless. It bent her, broke her, tore screams from her throat that were lost in the roar of the blizzard. Through it all, Thomas knelt beside her. His voice was a low rumble, a lifeline in the chaos. "Hold on," he said. Just 2 words, over and over. "Hold on, Clara." He pressed a cool cloth to her forehead, his calloused hands surprisingly gentle. And in that moment she realized something profound. The town had cast her out for creating a life. This man, this supposed killer, was fighting with everything he had to save one. Who was the real monster? The hours blurred into a nightmare of firelight and pain. Then, with one final soul-shattering cry, it was over. Silence descended on the cabin, a heavy, breathless silence. Thomas lifted the tiny, still form into his massive hands. Clara's heart stopped. "No," she whispered, the word a prayer. And then it came. A thin, reedy cry, piercing the howl of the wind. It was fragile, but it was fierce. It was life. Awe cracked the stone mask of Thomas's face. He wrapped the newborn in a cloth and gently placed the baby in Clara's arms. Tears streamed down her face as she looked at her daughter. "We're alive," she sobbed, pressing her lips to the baby's forehead. "We're alive." Outside, the storm raged on. But inside that cabin, 3 hearts beat as one, a tiny, defiant rebellion against the cold, cruel world, and the silence that had defined their relationship was finally filled, not with words, but with the sound of a new beginning. Days later, the sun finally broke through, turning the snow-covered mountain into a landscape of glittering diamonds. Clara felt stronger. She named the baby Abigail, Hope. She watched Thomas as he moved about the cabin, his silent purpose now focused on this new life. He patched the roof, he split wood, he even carved a tiny, rough-hewn horse from a block of pine. "For the child," he muttered, embarrassed by the act of tenderness. Clara took the little carving, her fingers brushing his. And she understood. This wasn't pity, this wasn't charity. It was something more, something deeper. But there was a shadow they couldn't outrun. The town. Their supplies ran low, and the dreaded trip down the mountain became unavoidable. As Thomas harnessed the mule, Clara felt a familiar knot of fear tighten in her stomach. But this time she wasn't walking into the storm alone. The moment they stepped into the general store, the air went cold. The chatter stopped. Every eye turned to her, sharp and accusing. Then Lydia Pike, the storekeeper's wife, spoke, her voice like cracking ice. "Well, look what the storm blew in, carrying your sin for all to see." Snickers rippled through the small crowd. Clara felt her cheeks burn. Shame, hot and familiar, washed over her. She wanted to shrink, to disappear. But then Thomas stepped forward. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. He just stood there, his sheer size casting a shadow that seemed to swallow all the hate in the room. He looked at them, one by one, his gray eyes hard and unyielding. The Snickers died. People looked away, suddenly fascinated by the floorboards, the cracker barrels, anything but him. The power in the room had shifted. His silence was louder than all their whispers. It was a wall, a shield. And for the first time, Clara walked out of that store with her head held high. She was no longer just the town's shame. She was the woman protected by the monster of the mountain. And that, she was learning, made all the difference. That night, back in the safety of the cabin, the weight of the town's judgment finally broke her. "They'll never see me as anything else," she whispered, her voice thick with tears. "They've decided who I am. And maybe they're right." Thomas stood by the fire, his back to her. For a long time he was silent. Then he turned, and his eyes caught the firelight. "People talk," he said, his voice a low rumble. "They talk because they're afraid of their own empty lives. Their words aren't about you, Clara. They're about them." He took a step closer. "You don't owe them a single breath." The words settled in the quiet room, solid and true. But there was something else in his eyes, a darkness, a history, and a thought, sharp and sudden, pierced through Clara's grief. He wasn't just talking about her. He was talking about himself. And she realized he wasn't just a stranger who happened to find her. Their stories were connected somehow. Why was he really here? What debt was he paying? A few nights later, Abigail was crying, a fussy, colicky wail that wouldn't stop. Clara was exhausted, rocking the baby, humming a tune she didn't realize she was humming. Thomas watched from his corner, a look of helpless concern on his face. "My mother used to sing that," he said, his voice quiet. Clara stopped, surprised. He never spoke of his past. She was a friend of your mother's," he continued, the words coming slow, as if pulled from a deep, painful well. "A long time ago, before the war." Clara stared at him. Her mother had died when she was a girl. She barely remembered her. "The land this cabin is on," Thomas said, his gaze distant. "It belonged to your family once. Your father lost it. To the sheriff." The name hit her like a punch to the gut. The sheriff. The sheriff, Thomas's voice grew hard, was my commanding officer in the war. He gave an order. A bad one. Good men died. When the inquiry came, he pointed his finger at me, said I acted alone. Suddenly, it all clicked into place. The puzzle pieces of her life rearranged themselves into a new, terrifying picture. Her father's ruin, the sheriff's power, Thomas's exile, her own casting out. They weren't separate events. They were all connected, all threads in a web woven by one man. "He sent you away," Thomas said, his eyes locking with hers, full of a cold, burning fire. "Not just because of the baby, Clara. He sent you up here because he wanted this land and he wanted you gone. He wanted you to disappear. He wanted her to die. The gifts weren't just kindness. The protection wasn't just mercy. It was war. A silent, one-man war against the most powerful man in the county. And Clara and her baby were standing right in the middle of it. The next morning the air was different, sharper. There was a tension in the silence between them now. They both knew the truth. This cabin wasn't a shelter anymore. It was a fort, and the enemy was coming. Thomas began to work with a new urgency. He reinforced the door, boarded up one of the windows. He checked his rifle, his movements clean and efficient. The soldier in him had woken up. Clara watched, a cold dread creeping into her heart. Days passed. Every snap of a twig, every call of a bird made her jump. She held Abigail close, her love for her daughter now tangled with a fierce, primal terror. Then, one afternoon, it happened, a rider appeared at the edge of the clearing. Not the sheriff, someone else, a deputy. He sat on his horse, his face pale, and called out, "McGraw, the sheriff wants to see you, and the woman. He says come down peaceably." Thomas stepped out onto the porch, his rifle held loosely in one hand. "We're not going anywhere," he said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of a death sentence. The deputy shifted in his saddle. "Don't make me come up there, McGraw. He's got a warrant. For her, for moral vagrancy." It was a lie. A flimsy excuse. They both knew it. This wasn't about the law. "You go back and tell the sheriff," Thomas said, raising the rifle slightly, "that his jurisdiction ends at the tree line." The deputy stared for a long moment, then wheeled his horse around and galloped away. The silence he left behind was deafening. The warning had been delivered. The next visitor wouldn't be coming to talk. Night fell like a black shroud. Thomas didn't light the lamp. They sat in the dark, the only light coming from the dying embers in the hearth. Abigail was asleep in Clara's arms. "He'll come tonight," Thomas said. It wasn't a guess. It was a certainty. "Why are you doing this?" Clara whispered into the darkness. "You could have stayed hidden. You didn't have to get involved." Thomas was quiet for a long time. She could hear the slow, steady rhythm of his breathing. "Because I made a promise to your mother," he said, his voice barely audible, "that I'd look after you, and because some men don't deserve to win." A floorboard creaked outside. Thomas was on his feet in an instant, rifle at the ready. The siege had begun. A voice cut through the night, oily and familiar. The sheriff. "Clara, I know you're in there. Come on out now. Don't make this difficult." Clara's blood ran cold. "She's not coming out, Sheriff," Thomas called back, his voice like iron. "McGraw, I should have known you were mixed up in this, hiding out with this filth. You always did have a taste for charity cases." A shot rang out, splintering the wood of the door frame. Clara stifled a scream, pressing Abigail tighter against her. Another shot, this time shattering the small window. They were trapped. Thomas moved silently in the dark, positioning himself by the boarded-up window. He was calm, focused. He had been here before, in other battles, in other wars. "You think you can hide from me?" the sheriff taunted. "I own this mountain. I own this town. And I own her." The monstrous arrogance in his voice made Clara's stomach turn. Then, from the darkness beside her, Thomas spoke, his voice low but clear. "He's not just talking about the land, is he, Clara?" She didn't have to answer. He knew. He knew the final, ugliest piece of the secret. The father of her child. It wasn't some long-gone lover. It wasn't the sheriff's son. It was the sheriff himself. The truth hung in the air, more shocking than the gunfire. This wasn't just a cover-up. It was an extermination. The sheriff wasn't here to run her out of town. He was here to erase his sin. And her. And the baby. "You hear me, McGraw?" the sheriff yelled. "Send her out or we burn you out." The smell of kerosene suddenly filled the air. Panic seized Clara. They were going to set the cabin on fire. "Thomas," she cried, her voice trembling. He put a finger to his lips, then pointed toward a loose set of floorboards under the cot. "A root cellar." He mouthed the words, "Go, now." She didn't want to leave him, but the thought of Abigail, of the smoke and flames. She scrambled under the cot, pried the boards loose, and slipped into the small, dark space below, pulling the boards back into place over her head. She could hear them splashing the fuel against the walls. She could hear the sheriff laughing, a cruel, triumphant sound. She clutched Abigail, praying to a God she wasn't sure she believed in anymore. Then she heard the scratch of a match, and the world outside her hiding place erupted in a roar of fire. Smoke began to seep through the floorboards. The heat was intense. Abigail started to cry, her small wails muffled against Clara's chest. Above her, she could hear the crackle and pop of the burning cabin. She could hear the sheriff shouting, but she couldn't hear Thomas. Fear, cold and absolute, gripped her. Was he dead? Had they shot him? She had to know. Pushing the floorboards aside, she peered out. The room was an inferno. Flames licked up the walls, eating the dry wood. And then she saw him. Thomas was a silhouette against the fire, moving through the smoke and flames. He wasn't panicking. He was fighting. He had kicked over the water barrel, soaking a blanket, using it to beat back the flames near the door. The sheriff and his men were outside, waiting for them to run out into their guns. But Thomas wasn't running. He was creating a path. He saw her head pop up from the cellar. He yelled, his voice raw. "The back! There's a loose log! Go!" She didn't hesitate. Crawling on her belly, shielding Abigail with her body, she scrambled toward the back of the burning cabin. She found it. A log near the base of the wall, loosened by the fire. With desperate strength, she pushed it aside, creating a small opening. She squeezed through into the cold night air, gulping it down. She was out. She was free. But Thomas was still inside. She turned, her heart in her throat, just in time to see the roof of the cabin give way. It collapsed inward with a deafening roar, sending a shower of sparks and embers into the night sky. "No!" Clara screamed, the sound torn from the deepest part of her soul. The cabin was gone, and Thomas was gone with it. The sheriff and his men were cheering, their dark shapes illuminated by the fire. They thought they had won. Clara lay hidden in the snow, tears freezing on her cheeks, her body shaking with grief and rage. She had to get away. For Abigail. She started to crawl, moving away from the light back into the darkness of the pines. But then a shape rose from the inferno. It was like a demon crawling from the pits of hell. Covered in soot, his clothes smoking, his face a grim mask of fury. Thomas. He was alive. He had a piece of burning timber in his hand, a makeshift club, and he charged. He let out a roar, not of pain, but of pure righteous anger. The sheriff's men scattered, terrified by the apparition that had just walked out of the fire. The sheriff fumbled for his pistol, his face a mask of disbelief. He fired a shot. It went wide. Thomas was on him in 2 strides. He swung the burning timber, knocking the gun from the sheriff's hand. The sheriff fell back into the snow, scrambling away like a rat. Thomas stood over him, the firelight dancing in his eyes. He didn't kill him. He didn't have to. He had broken him. He turned and walked toward Clara, his steps heavy but steady. He knelt in the snow in front of her, ignoring his burns, ignoring the smoking ruin of his home. He reached out a soot-stained hand and gently touched Abigail's cheek. "It's over," he rasped, and in the light of the fire that had taken everything, they were no longer just survivors. They were a family. The walk down the mountain the next morning was slow. Thomas, wrapped in a charred blanket, leaned on Clara for support. She carried Abigail, who was safe and warm. When they reached the edge of town, people stopped and stared. They saw the burned man, the disheveled woman, the tiny baby, and they saw the sheriff stumbling behind them, his face bruised, his uniform torn, prodded along by the end of Thomas's rifle. Justice had come down from the mountain. Thomas marched him straight to the center of town, to the steps of the church. He didn't say a word. He just pushed the sheriff to his knees. The story came out. Not from Thomas, but from Clara. Her voice, once timid and broken, was clear and strong. She told them everything, the lies, the threats, the fire, the truth about her baby. The townspeople looked at the man who had been their leader, their symbol of law and order, and they saw him for what he was, a monster. Lydia Pike tried to defend him, but the crowd shouted her down. The shame that had once belonged to Clara now settled on its rightful owner. They didn't need a trial. His guilt was written all over his face. They ran him out of town that day, and no one ever saw him again. In the end, Clara didn't stay. The town offered her a home, offered her charity, but she had learned the difference between charity and family. She and Thomas went back up the mountain. They rebuilt the cabin, log by log, their silent work a testament to their shared will. It was stronger this time. The foundation was deeper. Evenings were spent on the new porch, watching the sun set, painting the sky in colors of fire and peace. Clara would rock Abigail, and Thomas would sit nearby, carving another wooden animal. One evening, as the last light faded, he looked at the ashes of a long-dead fire pit. "Sometimes," he said, his voice quiet and deep, "the ashes hold more life than the flame ever did." Clara looked at him, at this man of scars and silence who had walked through fire for her. She looked at her daughter, sleeping peacefully in her arms, and she knew he was right. They had both been burned down to nothing, by shame, by betrayal, by the world. But here, in the ashes, they had found each other. They had built a life, not out of promises spoken in a church, but out of a trust forged in silence and a love proven by fire. And that was a foundation that no storm could ever wash away. If you enjoyed this story of redemption and courage, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more tales that will touch your heart. Thanks for watching.